So, covering Brexit, both pre-referendum and before referendum, one of the big things you would have seen, or big things you would have noticed, was the big thing to do with fishing. Now, Britain has, in the EU, a very, very good quota. And the big thing that you might be led to misunderstand is that a lot of these British fishermen don't seem to like it. Yet, one of the big things that has given them a lot of freedom, rather than just be solely restricted to selling their catch in the UK, they could sell it to Europe themselves. They could go to France, they could go to any one of these other European countries. Not only that, it expanded their fishing waters that they could fish in. Remember, leaving the EU and losing those fishing rights minimises their area of fishing by 66%. And as I've said multiple times, look, fish do not respect borders. They will go wherever the hell they want. And, these guys who are a lot of these strange thinking that goes on is that somehow leaving the EU they'll be able to catch more. That won't be sustainable. There will have to be regulations. And we've talked about Nigel Farage, the guy who, as I said, if I was a British fisherman and Farage wanted me to come on his big Brexit flotilla down the Thames, I'd be, I would say, oh yeah, sure, come on, man, and then I'd boot him off right into the Thames. Because Farage, for all his talk of standing up for Britain and trying to put Britain first, when he was given the opportunity to help British fishermen, he never turned up to the meetings to help them. It was left to, I can't remember the celebrity chef's name, to do a petition to help those fishermen out. And now, I highly recommend for good Brexit news the Financial Times, because they do such good articles, analysis on just what's going on. So this one comes from the Financial Times. So, fishermen from the Cornish port of New Lynn were among the most spirited Brexiteers. Now, you also remember that post-referendum, Grimsby, a big town that relies on its fishing industry, wants special exemption during Brexit. It wants to become a special port. So bear that in mind. That just shows how ridiculous it comes. They vote overwhelmingly to leave, but then they go, oh yeah, we want all these special rules that come apart with being the EU, so can we keep those and leave at the same time? Yeah, it just shows how ridiculous the stuff that's just going on at the moment with this Brexit stuff in the UK. So, days before the Britain's 2016 EU referendum, some sailed more than 300 miles from England's westernmost reaches to join a pro-Brexit flotilla on the Thames. Their persistence intending a visceral reminder of the working people, hard done by the EU's overwhelming regulation. Soon they will find out whether it was all worth it. As Britain tries to negotiate a 2-year transitional agreement with Brussels that is supposed to provide a smooth path for industry after the country leaves the EU next year, its fishermen fear they might be getting a raw deal. The arrangement proposed by Brussels would leave the UK in the EU's common fisheries policies for at least the next 2 years, but without a seat at the table to defend its interests in crucial negotiations. Its fishermen say they would be at the whim of rivals from France and Spain, for example, when it comes to divvy up catch quotas and agree regulations. They would absolutely rip us to shreds. It would be insane, says David says David Shivens, a skipper based at New Lynn, a Cornish fishing village that hugs the coast next to Penzance. Like other Brexit fishermen, he is demanding that Prime Minister Theresa May instead reclaim the country's territorial waters on Brexit Day in March 2019 or face the consequences. It is something that will never be forgotten, Mr. Stevens warned, as she and his father took a break from repairing their 20-metre trawler, the Crystal Sea. We don't want to be betrayed again. We waited years for this opportunity to come. To British fishermen, their treatment is a broad measure of Mrs. May's resolve, or lack thereof, to defend their nation's interest as Brexit proceeds. People are looking for fishermen to get a good deal from Brexit, Mike Park, a former skipper who is now head of the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association, explained. If we've been sold down the river, that doesn't bode well. Because of the richness of Britain's waters, fishing is one of the few sectors where the UK holds leverage over the EU. Some 85% of the fish caught in waters around Britain last year went to the EU boats, according to a report by Scottish Fishermen's Federation. The EU is determined to maintain access. So far, the government's rhetoric sounds promising for Britain's fishermen. George Eustace, a fishing minister and a Cornwall MP, has repeatedly pledged his support, and has Brexit supporting Environment Secretary Michael Gove. Fishermen are now quick to point out Mrs. May's narrow majority in Parliament and a vital support she won from the coastal communities in England and Scotland during last year's general election. The fear is that as talks intensify, she will be tempted to sacrifice fishing, which accounts for less than 1% of the UK economy, to secure concessions for bigger industries such as financial services or pharmaceuticals. British fishermen have been here before. When the UK joined the EU in 1937, the then Prime Minister Edward Heath allowed EU vessels into British waters in a late concession to seal the deal. It was an event that fishermen now recall with fury. We gave it all away, Mr. Stevens, father of David Sr., fumed. The consensus of Mr. Heath's decision were not immediately apparent, but it became evident over the next decade as the EU devised an all-important formula to divide the fish catch among its members, that the UK, and the Southwest in particular, was a big loser. In the area around Cornwall, for example, it holds just 8% of the annual cod quota, while France claims 73%. Quotas began to bite for Newland's fleet in the 1990s as the EU limited overall catches to try and curb overfishing. If you were kind, the French defended their interests very well, said Paul Telbock, head of the Cornish Fishermen's Producers Association, whose office overlooks Newlyn Harbour. Or, another way is, they did cheat and stole from the UK, and we've suffered since. Brussels has promised to accommodate the UK during the transitional period, even if it will no longer have a formal say in the all-important December Fisheries Council, an annual gathering where quotas are carved up. Yet, the distrust is such that many Brexit fishermen are convinced their rivals would use their power to punish them as vengeance for Brexit, or simply because that it is in their nature for fishing. Mr. Parker called it an almost nightmarish scenario for his constituents in Scotland. Cornish fishermen, such as Mr. Stevenson, who operate a mixed fishery, believe that they will be particularly vulnerable. At present, his nets are finding a filling with haddock among dozens of other species, including talbot and monkfish. Because the UK has such a small haddock quota in the waters around Cornwall, he ends up throwing the excess overboard to comply with EU rules. But next year, an EU discard ban will be extended to include haddock. Unless adjustments are made, boats like the Crystal Sea will have to stop fishing altogether as soon as they reach their haddock quota. The Cornish fleet could be forced to tie up he warned. The turkeys had voted for Christmas, said a net maker on the quarry, who was a rare Newlinite who opposed Brexit. With a wink, he said his name was Faldor, and then confessed his habit of reading Dostoevsky's novels while at sea. Some Brexiteers also confessed misgivings. Personally, I voted to leave. But even if I have some wobbles, said John Hawkin, who was cleaning and stacking crates at Newlands Fish Market, he didn't trust the government to stand by its fishermen. He was asked Mr. Hawkes to gaze at the harbour. Then the feeling is all very, very uncertain. So that's just a view of, like, you know, the fishermen. And I've said this before, they're going to lose out massively. I mean, you've got Grimsby, a town who overwhelmingly voted for Brexit, is now asking for basically a special deal because it wants all the advantages of being in the single market and customs union, but then doesn't want to be in it. So that's, as you can see, and fishermen are going to get absolutely screwed. And it's not going to be the EU's fault, by the way. It is going to be this government's fault, and they should not forget that. It was the British government that put them in this fault. It was the fault of someone like Nigel Farage, who was meant to show up at that annual fishing quota, but never did. And it's also the fault of the fishermen themselves, because they will not admit, they will not be truthful to how much they catch. Then, if they were truthful, the EU could then, you know, put in proper fishing quotas. But they won't. And this idea that these fishing quotas will disappear post-Brexit, there will have to be a replacement. There will have to be new British fishing quotas put in place. And, you know, some of these fisheries, they need the EU to survive. They need to be able to sell their catch to the EU countries, like in France or Spain. You know, they need access to that market. But, you know, as that one guy said, you know, the turkeys have voted for Christmas. What can you do about it? Because they've been led for years to believe that the EU is a bad thing. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that they haven't had, you know, bad things happen to them. But the problem is that they've then voted for people like Nigel Farage to go and represent them in the EU Parliament, and then when it has come time for Mr. Farage to stand up for these, you know, guys' interests, he didn't even turn up to the meetings. You know, that's literally the case. But, you know, there you go.